What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at you each and every week with a fresh weekend of debrief and effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm one of your hosts, Caleb Pearson. Joining me in the host spotlight this week, Miss Abby Lindenberg. Abby, how are you?
Good.
Good. It's rainy. It's gross out.
It's gloomy.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Joining us again in the podcast booth, Mark Carey. Mark, how are you?
I'm fine.
Good. Thank you. Back in the gospel, Mark. We took a 3-week break on spiritual warfare a little bit. You were upstairs in the BTC for 2 weeks. So just a real quick, was that fun?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, it was fun.
Good. Yeah, I heard good things from people.
was
And
tiring.
was it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, double the length. You're up there talking and speaking. So very cool, but excited
Fun.
to jump back
Lots
in.
of fun.
Jump back into it. So Abby, I'll come your way first briefly, and then Mark has some stuff for us. But in chapter 3, the recruiting of the 12, what stood out to you? And Mark, we'll kind of hear why you took the approach you did with the passage.
Yeah, well, it was just a recap of how he chose the 12 and kind of their journey with Jesus, which I kind of saw as more of like a model for discipleship for us today too, which I thought was really great. But I guess, I don't know what you gave a lot of hypotheticals to why he would have chosen them. Do you feel, is there any indication to any of the hypotheticals that you gave?
Probably
us?
not.
Okay.
But I had to fill time up somehow.
Yeah.
Well, that was my thought. It's a passage that's just describing, chose this guy,
Yeah.
then he chose this guy, then he chose this guy. It's the between the lines that we might be most fascinated with. So walk us through what you emphasize this weekend, and then what you can elaborate on.
Well, let me start with kind of the ending. I went through the phases,
Yeah.
you know, and,
Yes.
and a lot more could be said about that. In fact, Mark begins with the phase 2, you know, the come and follow me phase. Luke chapter 5 is a great passage because it develops a lot more. The crowds are pressing on Jesus. He's teaching. The boys have just come back from fishing, and they hadn't caught anything. And, you know, they're cleaning the nets, and how embarrassing for Jesus to preach right where they're cleaning nets that are pretty much empty, and they're fishermen. And so then he tells them, let's go out, you know, let's go fishing. Let's drop your nets out, let them down for a catch. And Peter says, you know, we worked all night and haven't caught anything. And, you know, you fish in the shallows at night, and Jesus told them go out to the deep during the day. You know, we're fishermen, you're not. But he said, okay, at your bidding, we'll do that. And then, you know, the story of the fish, or so the boat starts sinking and all that stuff. And that's when Peter says, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord. And it was like, he had seen Jesus. He you know, Andrew had introduced him during the come and see phase. But it was just an observation thing. They were back fishing and doing their thing. Something clicked with Peter when he saw Jesus for who he really was. And he saw himself for who he really was. Depart from me, O Lord. He had called him Rabbi before. Well, Rabbi, we worked hard all night, but if that's what you tell me to do, I'll go ahead and do it. And then it's, oh, Lord, and he's on his knees. And it's at that point Jesus commissions them, come follow me, and they drop everything and follow him in wholehearted commitment. That's where Mark starts the discipleship phase. And then the passage this week was the come and be with me. And so there's this selection of the 12. So Jesus is very purposeful and intentional. And he selects these 12, and there's an emphasis on that. We don't know much about these guys. You know, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, you know, Philip, everyone, Thomas, you know, there's a sentence or two here and there. But they're referred to as the 12 from that point on. So in the rest of the gospel account, chapter 4, verse 10, as soon as he was alone, his followers along with the 12. And chapter 6, verse 7, he summoned the 12. Chapter 9, verse 35, he called the 12. So they're grouped, and it's this 12. And part of, so then I went to the end and said there's a final phase. And in Luke chapter 22 at the upper room, and Matthew 19:28 records this upper room thing where he says, when I am in my kingdom, you're going to sit on the 12 thrones to judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, I didn't have time to really develop that other than to refer to it. But this number 12 is something that is significant. The 12, the 12, the 12. And then Jesus ties it to this eschatological coming of something in the future where they're going to sit on the 12 tribes or judge the 12 tribes of Israel in the end of age. And to me, that communicated Jesus' purposeful plan in selecting these men, the 12, because there's something yet to come. His plan is yet to be fulfilled. It does, to me, say something about the future of Israel. If you take it literally, now if you want to spiritualize it, and Israel doesn't mean Israel and that type of stuff, then, all bets are off. But he's talking about Israel, the 12 tribes, and he selects these. And then you go back to the Old Testament, and there was this focus on the 12 tribes, and the sons of Jacob, and follows throughout the Old Testament. And the 10 northern tribes, of course, were taken off to captivity in Assyria, and the 2 southern tribes, Benjamin and Judah, but they were still these 12 tribes. And one day the promise was both Jacob and Judah, Jacob and or Israel and Judah are going to come back together again, and God is going to fulfill his blessings to Jacob and Israel, the 12 tribes. And then Jesus says, and these guys are going to sit on the thrones. There's the new leadership. So it doesn't specifically say this in the text, but it's interesting how the religious leaders of Israel they're rejecting him, and they're plotting to kill. The leadership of Israel has made their choice. And it's like Jesus is now selecting the 12, and he's raising up this new leadership that will one day sit on the 12 thrones to judge and be the leaders of this restored, the restoration of a new Israel that's coming.
It seems like there's biblical precedent for that, as opposed to, it just happened to be that there weren't 13 people who took him seriously. There were just 12, or it could have been 11. Just happened to be 12. But to think of that intentionality, and at least in the Saturday night service, an offhanded comment of Judas will be replaced.
Yeah.
Where does that come from? Because that's where my mind went when I heard 12. I was like, wait a second.
Well, Matthias was replaced, and it was important for the disciples. They had to pick a 12th one.
Right.
And so they cast lots, which that's interesting, but they cast lots, we won't go into that. But and they selected Matthias. Someone asked me, what about Paul? Couldn't he have been the 12th apostle? And I said, well, my answer to that is he was an apostle, but he was geared for the Gentiles.
Right.
Because something shifts, as we saw in our study of Acts, from Israel to the Gentile and the church that's raised up. And Paul factors in now prominent. Interestingly, the 12 are mentioned in Acts chapter 6, verse 40, I think it is, or verse 7. And Acts chapter 6, verse 2. At this time, while the disciples were increasing in number, complaining arose among the Hellenistic Jews. And it so the 12 summoned the congregation of the disciples, and they had to deal with that whole thing in Acts chapter 6. That's the last time that the 12 are mentioned. Until you get to, Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians that when Jesus arose, he appeared to Cephas and the 12. So there's this designated group called the 12. The only other time it's mentioned is in Revelation 21, verse 14. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. In the final days, they're going to have a role as Jesus had predicted they would. But after Acts chapter 6, and the rejection and the persecution of Stephen in chapter 7, and persecution sets in, and then God, it's like he shifts his program, and Paul, the apostle, becomes prominent to this new entity called the church, which is the dividing wall is broken down between Jew and Gentile, and this whole new entity. So if there wasn't that Revelation 21 passage, you'd almost think
it's old hat.
That Jesus maybe decided not to have 12 thrones and 12 apostles.
Yeah.
But Revelation 21 speaks of in that final new heaven and new earth, that new Jerusalem, these guys are going to be there, those 12 thrones. And so it just is, I think, encouraging that somehow Jesus looked at these guys, the Bartholomew and the Thaddeus and, these guys, Simon the Zealot, which we don't really know much about. But he had a plan for them. They factored in the early church in the early days, and they're going to factor in the age to come, because God has a plan to raise up Israel once again, and those guys are going to sit on those 12 thrones judging Israel. So the rest of the time, like what we read in the Gospels, is kind of the training of these 12. And it's preparing them for leadership roles in some way. In the early church, maybe they're there in Acts, but you don't really hear much of them after that. But there's something that's going to come in the age to come. That's why, and I read from Matthew chapter 10, Jesus had said, don't go to the Gentiles or the Samaritans, go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The 12 are apostles sent to Israel. And in the early church, in those early chapters of Acts, there was this anticipation that God was going to restore all his promises to Israel. But it didn't happen, and you don't hear anything of the 12 anymore. One day we will, because of the promise of God.
And even some of those chapters in Romans bring up Israel and speak to the reality of Israel itself still being a part of God's plan.
Yeah,
so it's not that everything's switched.
If you take it literally, if you take Israel as Israel of the Old Testament, yeah.
And it's fascinating that it's when you don't take it literally or you apply something else on top of it, then you lose. Then you look at this passage that we had at FPC this weekend. You just think, okay, and this is what most teaching does. Let's just talk about these 12 different guys.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus grabbed a guy like this, a guy, and then that can be helpful, fun, whatever. But even that phrase, 12 apostles, has this much. All we've talked about is a number so far.
Yeah.
And we've already talked for almost 15 minutes. So it's just fascinating.
Yeah. It's why they were handpicked by Jesus after a whole night of prayer.
Yeah.
These guys are important. He sends them out with authority to cast out demons and do all this stuff.
Yep.
And after Acts chapter 6, what happened to them? You would think they would be all over the New Testament, prominent. Well, but they're not selected for the church. They're selected for Israel to replace the leadership that is gone in Israel for what's going to happen in the age to come, when God restores Israel, sets up his kingdom on earth, and those guys will factor in at that point. But so I think it's a good question to ask. Yeah. What happened to the 12? I thought they were big wigs.
Well, and they have Jesus's post-resurrection commission too.
That's right.
So how does that factor into what they did next?
That's true too. They're in the Acts chapter 2 or chapter 1. It's verse 8. You'll receive power, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem. That makes sense. In Judea and Samaria. Well, that makes sense. Even to the uttermost part of the world. Now, we know that the Romans came, the persecution set in, Acts chapter 8, even the persecution of Christians, but the Jewish dispersion. Peter writes to the diaspora, to Christians, probably Jewish Christians, scattered around the Roman Empire. So did these, where'd these guys end up? I mean, I did read a little bit here. Where do I have that here about these guys who of course,
something there too.
Peter was crucified at Rome, supposedly head upside down. Andrew was bound to a cross where he preached to his persecutors until he died. Of course, we know James, he was beheaded in Jerusalem by Herod. John was the one who lived out to an old age on the island Patmos. Philip was crucified in Areopolis in Phrygia, which is western Turkey, or west central Turkey, modern-day Turkey. Bartholomew, the tradition said, was skinned alive and then beheaded. Matthew suffered martyrdom by being slain with a sword in Ethiopia. Thomas, they said, was speared to death in India. James, the son of Alphaeus, some sources say that he was thrown off the pinnacle of the temple and then clubbed to death. Simon the Zealot, Tradition said he may have been crucified while ministering in Persia. Judas, the son of James or Thaddeus, some traditions said he was executed by arrows shot from archers. Matthias, who replaced Judas, was first stoned and then beheaded. I mean, these are what traditions say. Oh, and by the way, they really never did see Jesus rise from the dead. They made all that up.
Right. They did that for a lie.
Right. They did all this because for a lie. Yeah. So what happened to these guys and what we don't know. Mm-hmm. But I'm confident one day we'll see them sit on thrones in Jerusalem and reign.
Well, and I appreciate the point you brought out of Jesus spending all night in prayer and then this happening, because it's easy to assume Jesus has a call to follow, and then almost as if so many people don't take that call seriously, Jesus kind of looks in a circle and says, I guess I'm stuck with you 12. You know, the crazy dozen that are dumb enough to follow me.
Yeah.
But this was very intentional.
Yeah.
And it's not like Jesus came down here to then kind of test the waters and see. It's all part of that plan.
All part of the plan.
And it's so cool to see that narrative.
Yeah. Interesting thing else I found out as I was reading about this 12 and the purposefulness and intention of Jesus. They're all the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all give the list of the the story and these names. Mm-hmm. But the way they do it, and some of them are a little different order, except for three guys. The 12 are grouped in groups of 4. So there are 3 groups, and there's apparently a leader in each of the group of 4 because the name, Peter is the first of them all, and then there's 3 other names, and then Philip is the name that is similar in all the groups, and then there are other names.
Right.
And then the last group is James of Alphaeus, and he is the next. So the indication would be among these 12, there were 3 groups of 4, and there was a leader. Peter was probably the overall leader, but he was the leader of the first group, Philip of the second.
Interesting.
Yeah, and James, the son of Alphaeus of the next group, because those are the 3 names that remain consistent in all the groups.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's another maybe conjecture, but it is interesting that those 3 are the same in all the lists at the leading of each group.
Yeah.
That order.
Well, and even at the very least, obviously the authors are divinely inspired. But if they're recounting these guys, if those are always the same listed, then they're kind of like, okay, who else? Oh yeah, this other name. But those names right away were the first one.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, who else? And then naming that, and so it's interesting to see the variety of that. But
yeah. I had a question you were talking about the fisher of men and the reference in the Old Testament versus the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you kind of made it sound like that was like a negative thing.
Yes.
The fishers of men. But in the New Testament, it was more positive.
It's like Jesus had a little different spin on it.
Yeah.
The Old Testament, those fishers of men were the Babylonians, sent to judge and take them off into captivity.
Yeah.
The only connection, and I was trying to make this, is that Jesus had now pronounced that the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel. There is a warning and a blessing with the coming of the kingdom. If for Jews who did not accept Jesus, the warning is judgment. And so these disciples are out there, they're proclaiming a warning. Behold, the kingdom of God is at hand. Get ready. And if you don't, judgment was coming. But Jesus added that other blessing. But if you do accept, there are these blessings that'll come. You see that in Book of Acts as Peter is preaching. He kind of lays in hand that know for certain that God has made this Jesus both Lord and Messiah, whom you crucified. So repent and believe the gospel, or judgment is going to come. There is that theme. Jesus said it. He wept over Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I wanted to gather you, but you would not. We're going to see that this coming weekend in the next passage. 40 years later, thereabouts, judgment came. The Romans came, and horrendous acts of violence and murder against the Jewish people took place because they did not heed the promise of believing the good news that the kingdom had come. So then we know that the kingdom is postponed,
right?
And that God begins this whole new church age thing, which that was a head scratcher for the Peter, James, John, those guys. That what? What do you mean? Peter goes to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. He said, I'll never do. No, Lord, I'm a good Jewish boy. And God is saying, no, what God has made clean, don't call unclean. And all of a sudden the door is opening up to something totally new that it's called a mystery, because it was not revealed in the Old Testament like it was and then Paul is raised up as the apostle, and this whole 2,000 years has been
Church age, baby.
the church age.
Yep.
And no matter what your ethnic background, Jew, Greek, no matter what you're all coming under the cross of Christ and invited to be a part of the family of God, the church of Jesus Christ. Romans chapter 11, however, says, we are grafted in,
right,
he says in the first part of Romans 11, to something new, to this rich root of these promises from the Old Testament, because of the blood of the covenant that the Messiah shed, and we get grafted into that. But he says in the end of chapter 11, good news, the deliverer is going to come from Zion, and thus all Israel will be saved, because how does he put it? Because the calling and the gifts of God are irrevocable. What God has promised, he will bring it to pass. And that's where the 12 will show up again, I think, in the end of the age. It all fits, but the rest of, I think, Mark's gospel is going to be, at least we will see how he trains these 12 and how they failed and failed and failed again. And it really, I think, becomes for the Roman believers reading this, it becomes a manual in discipleship.
Yeah.
Because they're living under persecution and tough times. And if he's called these 12 to that, pick up your cross, deny yourself. If you want to gain your life, you got to lose it. If you want to save your life, you got to give it. You got to die. And that's the call of discipleship that he calls these men to, which they ultimately did and gave it all. So,
exciting. Yeah. The story will continue.
Yes, there will, because there is an unpardonable sin coming up in the next few verses. So we'll have to see what that's all about.
Yeah.
But
Mark, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Abby, thank you very much. Just point people to a couple of things as far as the summer. We do have Disciple Makers Multiplied coming June 16th to 20th. For our youth students, 7th through 12th grade, you can register for that on the student page of our website. They're going to be doing the Book of Daniel. They come from Texas, and we all week long meet in the youth lobby. It's an awesome time. And then I also want to remind people of VBS. Registration's live for that. That'll be June 23rd through 27th for all the elementary age kids. So a lot of exciting stuff coming up this summer. You can find all that and more at our website. For all our listeners and viewers, remember that we love to hear from you. You can find us at fbcva.org/podcast.
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
And one other thing.
Yeah.
We've had questions about that series on spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
And at some point here in the next few weeks, we're probably going to do some type of a family podcast or something.
So we recorded one with Scott, Mark Francis, and I.
Right.
So that'll be uploaded.
And their full interview that Scott and Annette did of 40 minutes will be on.
Yeah, so the three-part series of Scott and Annette's testimonial, that full 40 minutes is online, and then we'll have some Fellowship Family episodes coming up as well. And that topic will really continue through Mark.
So if people did have questions, you can
Yep.
shoot them to the church, and we'll maybe address them there.
Yeah, we'd love to do it. So the fact of the matter, everybody, is that sermons are not meant to just take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love. God bless.